They had old clothes. Their clothes were 40 years old. And they still lusted out in the desert. Idolatry, fornication, tempting Christ, murmuring, complaining, griping. Those 5 sins kept them out of the promised land. Then I want you to notice, I don't know whether this is just a coincidence, but if you'll notice in verse 8, there are also 5 types of sin that are mentioned, which essentially, these are the things that make harmonious human relationships impossible if you got these 5 working in your relationship. Number 1, anger. Number 2, wrath. Number 3, malice. Number 4, blasphemy. And number 5, filthy language. And you know what anger is, but now wrath is anger that is acted out. Wrath is the expression of anger. And then malice, you know, like when people murder with malice, and blasphemy, and filthy language. When it's filthy language, that's not just somebody talking nasty to you. That's not what that's abusive speech. It is hurtful speech. Filthy language, that's filthy language. It's not somebody telling, oh baby, I'm gonna tell you what I want to do to you. No, that's not the one it's talking about. No, that's talking about abusive. See, because when some women hear that, they don't feel abused at all. And if they do, they want to be abused. But it's the abusive language that puts you down, that diminishes your self-worth, your self-esteem, that makes you condemned in yourself, that makes you feel rejected. That's abusive speech. You're not anything. You're not going to be anything. You're stupid. That's abusive speech. Calling people dumb and fat. It's abusive speech. Retarded. That's abusive speech. Ugly. That's abusive speech. That hurts a person. That's filthy language. It's abusive speech. But it's those 5 things. And let me just tell you this. Notice in verse 8, it says, but now you yourselves are to put off these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. And notice that same verse in the Amplified. But now put away and rid yourselves completely of all these things: anger, rage, bad feeling toward others, curses and slander, and foul-mouthed abuse and shameful utterances from your lips. See, he's dealing with these 5 different categories here. And the sins in this list are really worse than the sins that are listed in verse 5. Because the ones that are in verse 5 are these are carnal sins of the flesh, but these that are listed in verse 8 are sins of the spirit, of the heart. And let me just tell you this. I know people who are involved in carnal sin of the flesh, fornicating and that kind of thing, and their hearts are really sweet and tender. But when you got somebody in verse 8 that's got abusive language and malice and anger and wrath, do you know that there are saved people who have anger problems? I mean, serious anger problems that are out of control, and the behavior is irrational. You can't even talk to them when they get angry. I would rather deal with a prostitute who's got a problem with sexual immorality, but whose heart is sensitive and tender, and she wouldn't hurt anybody, because her sin is not of the spirit, is of her flesh. It's easier to fix a flesh issue than it is a spirit issue with the heart. So you can have the prostitute get saved and she become a wonderful Christian because Christ comes in and does the work in her heart, and it begins to change the external stuff because she only had a problem with the outside. It's much easier to drive a car around with your outside dented than to have your motor jacked up. So, but notice just those 5 sins in verse 5, and then the 5 that are in verse 8, and then the 5 sins that kept the children of Israel out of out of the promised land. But ironically, 5 is also the number of grace. It is to say that where sin doth abound, there does the grace of God much more abound. Because we got all of those 5 things, and so God gave us 5 graces as well when he gave apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. So there is a grace of God that comes. There's a grace of God that comes wherever there is sin. There's a grace that comes. You know, it is said of Jonathan Edwards, who was the 3rd president of Princeton, that he had a daughter that was ungovernable. She had an ungovernable temper. And as often is the case, the problem was not known to the outside world. And so a young man fell in love with his daughter and sought her hand in marriage. And so he goes to the father, Jonathan Edwards, and asks, can he have her hand in marriage? And he says, you can't have her. The young man said, but I love her. And Edwards said, but you can't have her. The young man said, but she loves me. And again, Edwards said, you can't have her. The young man said, why? And he said, because she's not worthy of you. And then the young man said, but she is a Christian, is she not? And the father said, yes, she is a Christian. And these were the next words that really got me. He said, yes, she is a Christian. He said, but the grace of God can live with some people with whom no one else could ever live. Touch a neighbor, say, I know that person. But it is true, the grace of God can live with a person that nobody else can live with. Isn't that amazing? And you know what, I've had to tell people, I've had to look up toward heaven and say, God, that's your child. I'm telling him in essence, you know, you're the only one that can really live with this one. That's, God, that is your child. You deal with them. Have you ever felt like you've had to do that with God? Because there are people that only God, by his grace, could even deal with them. Notice verse 9, do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds. You see, this thing is also about putting on something, and it's about pulling off something, but you can't put on something until you pull off the old thing that you had. See, this deals with the admonition not to deceive one another. Not to deceive one another. That corrodes relationship when you deceive, and it makes it impossible then to trust. And trust is the foundation of all of our relationships. It's interesting. Notice verse 10 and 11. And have put on, see, notice you pull off the old man, and then verse 10, you put on the new man who is renewed in the knowledge according to the image of him who created him. And notice it says in verse 11 that where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. See, the previous verse dealt with the putting off of the old man, but now this is shifting to putting on the new man who has been renewed in his mind according to Christ. The new or renewed mind of Christ is that high mind that we are to possess. This is the lofty mind which holds the heavenly values and also the heavenly perspective. I think that we are seated with Christ in heavenly places, not for it to go to our head and swell our heads, but to give us a perspective of God. Because the new mind, when you get the new mind of Christ, that lofty mind, that you become high-minded, where your mind is like his on high, not that high, on high. The new mind transcends racial barriers. Racial barriers. That's what Greek or Jew was about. That was a racial barrier. Greek and Jew. That was a racial barrier. The new mind transcends that. It transcends racial barriers. Then it transcends religious barriers, circumcised or uncircumcised. That was a religious barrier because the Jews did circumcision. Circumcision or uncircumcision. That was a religious barrier. The renewed mind transcends that. The renewed mind transcends cultural barriers. That's barbarian and Scythian. Cultural differences. Cultural differences. They called people barbaric that were different than them, who had different customs and culture. They were cultural differences. And then the renewed mind also transcends social barriers, which are slave or free. That's a status. It transcends that. So when you possess the mind of Christ in its realness, I mean in its realness, when America really embraces the mind of Christ, it transcends racial barriers and religious barriers and cultural barriers and social barriers. And you just love people. You love people, not just people who look like you. You love people. That's the mind of Christ. Jesus didn't just come for his own kind, for Jewish people. He loved, God so loved the world and all of its different ethnicities. He loved the world that transcended social status. He loved the last, the lost, and the least. And he came because his mind was lofty. He could see that despite the education and the money and the titles and the positions, these are still all my children. Do you think it's going to cause you to love your children any less because one has more than the other one? Because one is a different complexion than the other one? Because one has a different kind of hair than the other one? And may I just remind you, I told you, we don't really have a skin problem. We have a sin problem. The devil doesn't just come to try to divide people because they are racially different. He comes wherever there is a difference. You can find division. We have a greater problem with black on black crime than we do with white on black crime or black on white crime. So it's not even about being different. Our great issue is the fact that there is a demonic spirit that'll even come in a family and pit people. You ever heard of a person being called the black sheep of the family? And they weren't even accepted in their own family. They could be blood related, and yet they are treated differently than everybody else. And so God wants us to be high-minded, to where we transcend all of these things that divide us, so that we can love like he loves, and that we can gravitate toward seeking the right things and setting our minds and crucifying in our flesh what needs to be crucified, you know, and really living this life after God that he's given us to live, that we will put on the new man and walk in the newness of life and glorify God. I'm just loving Colossians because it's such a real book that speaks to our life, and it brings such marvelous edification to the Spirit of Jesus Christ, who's Lord over us all. Christ is our life. He is the life of every Christian. He is our life, and we have to give him preeminence in our life. I pray that you got something out of the word of the Lord.
Thank you for watching Power for Living with Bishop Dale C. Bronner. Join us again next time for Power for Living, where revelation is power. Power for living.